At 9:17 in the morning, Aidan Cole walked through the glass doors of Sterling Harbor with his daughter's small hand locked in his and a sealed envelope pressed against the inside of his worn brown jacket. Charlotte Sterling, the company's young CEO, looked at his faded clothes and ordered security to call the police. The entire boardroom laughed when he was forced to his knees on the marble floor, but when the attorney opened his case and read aloud the true owner of record, every smile in that room went still, and the sirens outside suddenly sounded very small. Stay until the very end, because the last thing the little girl says will silence the entire room. The morning Sterling Harbor opened its doors to the world. The city was still cold. Frost clung to the edges of the floor-to-ceiling glass facade, and the pale November light bounced off polished marble floors inside. Executives in tailored suits moved through the lobby at a practiced pace, badges glinting at their hips, phones pressed to their ears, every motion calibrated to suggest they belonged somewhere important and needed to be there fast. Outside on the broad front steps, a line of black sedans waited with engines idling, drivers standing at attention, exhaust curling into the brittle air. Business reporters had gathered near the entrance barriers. Word had gotten out that Sterling Harbor Capital was about to announce the largest asset restructuring in the company's 20-year history. The cameras were ready. The story was already half written. No one noticed the car that pulled into the far end of the parking lot, a 10-year-old Civic with a dent above the rear wheel well and a faded blue parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror. Aidan Cole cut the engine, sat a moment, then reached back and unbuckled his daughter from her booster seat. Grace climbed out holding a worn white stuffed rabbit by one ear, its stitched nose nearly rubbed smooth. She blinked at the glass tower above her and moved without thinking to press her side against her father's leg. Aidan crouched down in front of her on the cold pavement and straightened the collar of her small coat. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with one bad night. His own jacket brown canvas with fraying cuffs had been clean when he put it on that morning, and that was enough. Beneath it, pressed flat against his ribs, was a manila envelope stamped with the wax seal of Clark and Associates, attorneys at law. He had spent the better part of the previous night organizing the documents inside it, not rehearsing what to say, not planning confrontations, just making sure the paperwork was right. "Daddy," Grace said, looking up at the building, "are they going to be mad?" Aidan studied her face for a moment before he answered, "Only if they don't listen." He stood, took her hand, and walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open. Inside, the lobby was warm and enormous, every surface chosen to communicate wealth without effort. The woman at the front desk looked up from her station and let her gaze move over Aidan from his collar to his shoes, then down to Grace, then back to Aidan. Her expression did not change, but something in it settled a quiet closing of a door. No one greeted him. No one reached for an access badge. No one asked if he needed help. No one knew that the man in the canvas jacket and the worn shoes was the only person in that building who could stop a vote that was scheduled to happen in 47 minutes. He walked to the front desk and told the receptionist he needed to see Charlotte Sterling before the morning signing. The receptionist asked for his name and a meeting confirmation. He gave his name and said there was no confirmation, but that the CEO would want to hear what he had before she put pen to paper. The receptionist looked at him the way people look when they have already decided what they are going to do next and are simply waiting for a polite pause in the conversation to do it. She reached for the phone, not to call the executive suite, to call security. 3 years had passed since Aidan Cole stopped wearing suits. It had been gradual, the way that kind of withdrawal usually is. He had not decided one morning to leave the financial world. He had simply found himself, after his wife's death, unable to care about the things he used to care about: the conference calls, the term sheets, the careful choreography of who sat where in a boardroom and what that meant. Margaret had made a joke about it once, before she got sick, telling him that the most dangerous person in any negotiation was the one who had nothing left to prove. At the time, he had laughed. Afterward, the line had begun to feel more like a compass heading. He made a living now as a quiet consultant, the kind whose name rarely appeared on letterhead, advising 2 or 3 investment funds on structural risk, and occasionally reviewing contracts that other attorneys had flagged as problematic. It was enough to pay for Grace's school and their apartment, and the occasional pancake breakfast he used as a bribe for good behavior on difficult mornings. It was not a glamorous life. It suited him. What most people did not know, what he had not told Grace's teachers or his neighbors, or the men he sometimes played cards with on Thursday evenings, was that he was the controlling trustee of the Cole Family Trust. Margaret had been meticulous about privacy. She had worked in financial compliance for nearly a decade before her illness, and she had understood, better than most, that visible wealth was a liability. The trust had been structured to protect the family's assets and, as it turned out, had accumulated a position in Sterling Harbor that no one outside a small circle of attorneys had ever fully examined. Preferred shares, secured debt instruments, a quiet right of first refusal on any major divestiture. On paper, the Cole Family Trust held more structural leverage over Sterling Harbor's balance sheet than any individual board member in that building. Aiden had not planned to use any of it, but 3 weeks earlier, Samuel Clark had called him at 11 in the evening and walked him through a proposed transaction that Sterling Harbor's CFO, Xavier Blackwood, had been quietly assembling. The deal would sell off the company's pediatric care and rehabilitation hospital division at a figure roughly 38% below its assessed value to a buyer whose corporate structure traced back, through 2 shell companies registered in Delaware, to a holding entity connected to members of Blackwood's extended network. The sale would strip the company of its most defensible long-term asset. It would also dissolve the protected endowment that funded care for children in the hospital's lowest-income ward. That endowment was something Margaret had noticed once, in a filing. She had noted it in the margin of a document that Aiden still had in a folder at home. He had never been able to throw it away. He had tried to reach Charlotte Sterling through proper channels. His letters sent through Samuel's office, with full legal headers and certified delivery, had gone unanswered for 12 days. 3 follow-up notices had been dispatched in the final 48 hours. None had received a reply. The explanation, as Aiden would later understand it, was not indifference. It was obstruction. Grace's school had called on a Tuesday to say that her teacher was ill and classes were canceled. Aiden looked at the calendar and realized there was no more time to wait. He packed Grace's rabbit and drove to Sterling Harbor. The pancake breakfast could wait until after. On the 41st floor, Charlotte Sterling stood at the head of the conference table, with her hands resting on its polished edge and her eyes moving across a column of projected figures she had already memorized. She was 28 years old and had been running this company for 14 months, and she had not yet decided whether she found that fact remarkable or simply exhausting. The board had been skeptical of her from the beginning, not because she lacked the credentials, her record was clean, and her instincts had been validated twice in the first year, but because she was young, and because she was a woman, and because neither of those things changed as quickly as they were supposed to in industries built on the premise that everything was changing. The criticism rarely came directly. It arrived in the form of silence after she spoke, or in the extra beat of consideration that certain senior members gave to Xavier Blackwood's suggestions, regardless of their merit. Xavier stood near the window now, watching the numbers on the screen with the relaxed expression of a man who had already decided how the meeting would end. He was 45, silver-templed, and possessed of the particular kind of intelligence that presented itself as wisdom without requiring any. He had been CFO for 6 years before Charlotte's appointment, and he had learned, in that time, how to make his preferences sound like logical conclusions. "The offer window closes tonight," he said, not looking at her. "If we table this past noon, we lose the favorable terms." Charlotte had heard some version of this argument 7 times in the past 4 days. She had also noticed, without comment, that the pressure never seemed to ease. Someone was always calling. Someone always had a new reason why speed was more important than caution. That accumulation of urgency had begun to feel less like crisis management and more like choreography. "I understand the timeline," she said. "Then you understand we don't have room for hesitation." She did not answer that. The word hesitation had been landing on her like a small accusation since she took this position, and she had trained herself not to flinch at it. Her assistant, Lisa Grant, appeared in the doorway with the quiet knock she used when the news she carried was not entirely welcome. "Miss Sterling," she said, "there's a man in the lobby asking to see you." His name is Aiden Cole. He says it has to do with a voting right connected to the divestiture, and he's requesting 5 minutes before the signing. Who sent him? Charlotte asked. He says he's here on behalf of something called the Cole Family Trust. Xavier turned from the window and said, without missing a beat, these things always happen on deal days. Someone reads the trade press and decides to make a play. Security can handle it. Charlotte would have agreed. Then Lisa added, almost apologetically, he has a little girl with him. Something tightened in Charlotte's jaw. She did not like children being used as props in corporate disputes. She had seen it done before, with calculated softness, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Xavier read her expression with the precision of a man who had been watching her face for months. He said quietly, someone who brings a child to a boardroom floor is someone who wants an audience, not a conversation. Charlotte thought of her father, who had lost $3 million and a decade of goodwill to a man whose business pitch had included a photograph of his family on the desk. The memory settled over her like a trained reflex. She told Lisa to have security, handle it, and handle it professionally. She turned back to the figures on the screen. What she did not see from 41 floors up was the way Aiden Cole stood in the lobby below. Still, patient, not like a man waiting to be let in, like a man waiting for people to understand they had already made a mistake. Mason Rowe arrived in the lobby wearing the blank expression of a man who considered a clear building his personal accomplishment. He was 40, broad across the shoulders, and had served as Sterling Harbor's head of security for 6 years. He stopped in front of Aiden with his hands clasped behind his back, and his chin lifted a fraction higher than was necessary for ordinary conversation. Sir, do you have a scheduled appointment? I don't, Aiden said. I have legal standing. My name is Aiden Cole. I'm the trustee for the Cole Family Trust. That name should be in your compliance database under secured creditor filings for Sterling Harbor Capital. Mason keyed something into the tablet at his hip. Nothing came back. What Aiden did not know, in that moment, was that Xavier Blackwood had spent part of the previous afternoon on a phone call with IT that resulted in a temporary suspension of several external access flags, specifically those tied to trust instruments and preferred shareholder alerts. The explanation given had been a scheduled security audit. The effect had been that Aiden Cole's name appeared nowhere on any active clearance list. I'm not finding anything, Mason said. His tone remained neutral, but the absence of apology in it was loud. Then call Samuel Clark. He's our attorney of record. He'll confirm everything. Mason looked at him the way people look at someone who has just given them an excuse not to act. He did not call Samuel Clark. Grace tugged very lightly on her father's sleeve. Daddy, she said, barely above a whisper, should we just go home? Aiden looked down at her. The lobby's cold light caught the thinning patches on the rabbit's ears, the slightly loose button on her coat that he had been meaning to resew. He squeezed her hand once. Stand right here behind me, okay? I've got you. By then, Charlotte had come down from the elevator with Xavier at her shoulder, and Lisa 2 steps behind, moving through the lobby with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had practiced entrances. The crowd of employees near the security desk parted without being asked. Charlotte looked at Aiden Cole. She took in the canvas jacket, the creased dark trousers, the worn leather shoes, the small child pressed against his leg, holding a stuffed animal that had clearly been loved past the point of presentability. She made a calculation in the space of about 2 seconds, and the calculation felt, in the moment, entirely reasonable. I'm Charlotte Sterling. You have 1 minute. My name is Aiden Cole. I represent the Cole Family Trust. I need you to delay the signing by 10 minutes. She looked at him steadily. Do you understand what's on the table today? Enough to know that if you sign before reading what I have, you'll spend the next 18 months trying to undo it. Charlotte's expression did not change, but something beneath it shifted a fraction of attention, a momentary pull of recognition. She let it pass. You're in my building, she said, asking me to halt a $400 million transaction, and you're carrying an envelope you won't open in front of me. The envelope stays sealed until it's opened before a lawyer and the relevant parties, Aiden said. That's not obstruction, that's procedure. This building, he added, is not entirely your company. The lobby was not quiet, but it became so in a radius of about 10 feet. Charlotte felt the attention from employees at the edges of the space, the slight lean in her direction from people trying to hear. She knew what visible hesitation would cost her today, and she did not intend to pay it. She turned to Mason. "If he won't leave," she said, with no particular emotion in her voice, "call the police." Mason moved to stand squarely in front of Aiden and told him, in the measured tone of someone reading from an internal script, that he was on private property, that no appointment had been verified, and that continued presence constituted trespassing under the building's posted policies. He said it all without volume, which somehow made it worse. Aiden did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He said, "If Miss Sterling signs before she reads the filing in this envelope, she is signing away an asset she does not have the unilateral authority to divest. That is not a threat. That is a procedural fact." Xavier leaned toward Charlotte and said, just above a whisper, "He used the word authority. He's escalating." Charlotte looked at the envelope under Aiden's arm, at the wax seal, at the label with Clark and Associates printed in small, formal type. Something at the back of her attention snagged on it. But Xavier was already speaking again, reminding her of the timeline, the board's expectations, the reporters outside who were going to write the story of today one way or another. She turned away, and then Grace said very quietly, "Daddy." It was nothing, a one-syllable word, but the smallness of it in that enormous marble lobby was impossible to ignore. Grace had pulled the rabbit up against her chest with both arms, and her eyes had gone glassy in the way that 6-year-olds' eyes go when they have decided not to cry but have not fully succeeded. The word dangerous had passed through the air above her head. She did not know exactly what it meant, but she understood it was about her father, and her body had made its own conclusion. Aiden heard her and turned. He crouched for just a moment, one hand on her shoulder, and said something in a low voice that no one else could make out. Then he straightened and looked back at Mason. "Don't touch him," Aiden said, when Mason moved closer. Not loudly. It carried anyway. Mason, who had been told by Xavier that the situation was already elevated, pulled out his radio. When the police cruiser pulled up outside and the sound of its door reached the lobby, the already quiet room went a different kind of still. Employees at the edges of the space stopped pretending not to watch. 2 managers who had been waiting for an elevator turned away from it, as though it was important to see what happened next. Sergeant Logan Brewer came through the front doors with a professional calm that was entirely genuine. He had been given a brief description over the radio. An agitated male, unscheduled, refusing to leave a corporate building, carrying an unidentified sealed package. He assessed the scene quickly. An older security chief, a man in a jacket standing with a child, a woman in an expensive suit watching from a distance with no readable expression on her face. He said, in the way of experienced officers who have walked into situations they haven't fully mapped, "Let's just slow everything down here." Mason gave him a version of events that was accurate in its facts and misleading in its tone. The word agitated appeared again. The phrase refused multiple requests, and Xavier, who had positioned himself nearby, added that the man had made statements that could be characterized as threats regarding the company's legal standing. Logan looked at Aiden. "Sir, I'm going to need you to set the envelope down. It's sealed legal material with chain of custody documentation. I'll set it down in front of my attorney. Your attorney's not here. He will be in approximately 4 minutes. Logan paused. 4 minutes was a specific number. Specific numbers usually meant something, but Mason was already moving, and Logan had not yet received enough information to override a direct security request in a private building. He asked Aiden to kneel on one knee as a precautionary measure while the situation was assessed. It was the kind of request that carried no malice but could not be refused without escalation. The room went absolutely silent. Aiden looked once at Grace. She was watching him with her whole face, the rabbit pressed against her front, her lower lip held between her teeth. He looked back at Logan. Then slowly, with the unhurried control of a man who had made a choice, he lowered himself to one knee on the marble floor. 2 men near the elevator exchanged a look. One of them almost smiled. Xavier did not bother to hide his. And Charlotte Sterling, standing 20 feet away in the lobby of the company her father had built and that she had spent 14 months trying to prove she deserved to lead, watched a man kneel on the floor in front of her, and told herself she had done the right thing. Then Grace said, in a small, clear voice, "Daddy didn't do anything." Charlotte did not move. But something in her eyes changed, as though a word had been said in a language she recognized, but was not expecting to hear. On the far side of the lobby, the elevator doors opened. Samuel Clark stepped out carrying a leather document case. Samuel Clark was 58 years old and had been practicing financial litigation for 31 of those years. He walked the way people walk when they are accustomed to rooms trying to move around them. He was not a tall man, and he was not carrying anything that looked dramatic. But there was something in his pace deliberate, without being slow, quiet, without being meek, that made the space around him different. He reached the center of the lobby in perhaps 12 seconds, looked at Aiden on the floor, and said, to no one in particular, but with the audibility of a man who had spent decades speaking to rooms that were not always quiet, "I would like to know who authorized this." Mason blinked. "Sir, if you could, I'm Samuel Clark. I am the attorney of record for Cole Family Trust, and that is my client on the floor. I am asking who gave the order." Charlotte stepped forward. "I'm Charlotte Sterling." "Miss Sterling." Samuel did not offer his hand yet. He opened the case, withdrew a leather credential holder, and offered it with both hands. "My bar card, my certification of appearance, and a copy of the trust instrument that establishes my client's standing in this building." He paused. He should be standing up. Logan had been reading the credentials for approximately 15 seconds. He looked at Mason, then at Aiden. "Sir," he said quietly, "you can stand." Aiden stood. He did not look at Charlotte. He did not look at Xavier. He looked at Grace, put his arm around her shoulders, and held her against his side. That was the first thing he did, not straightening his jacket, not scanning the room. His daughter first. Samuel then produced a second document from the case and held it where Charlotte and Logan could both see it. 3 registered notification letters were dispatched to this address over the past 48 hours. 1 was sent directly to the office of the CFO, and 2 to the General Counsel's attention. I have certified mail receipts for all 3. He looked at Lisa, who had been standing quietly behind Charlotte throughout. "You may want to check your received items." Lisa's face went slightly pale. She reached for her phone. Xavier said, from a position slightly behind Charlotte's left shoulder, "Anyone can produce documents. That doesn't establish. The trust holds $41 million in preferred equity and has security interest over $112 million in convertible debt instruments." Samuel, let that land before continuing. "The sale you are proposing to execute this morning requires notarized consent from the Cole Family Trust under Clause 14C of the original capitalization agreement. Without that consent, any instrument signed today is legally contestable and almost certainly void." No one in the lobby said anything. "I think," Samuel said, with the patience of a man who had expected exactly this, "we should take this upstairs." Charlotte agreed to the boardroom, partly because she needed the privacy, and partly because the number of employees now gathered at the edges of the lobby was no longer something she could pretend not to see. In the elevator, Charlotte stood at the front and did not speak. Aiden stood at the back with Grace. At some point between the ground floor and the 41st, Grace quietly took her rabbit in both hands and rested her head against her father's arm. No one commented on it. No one looked directly at them, which was its own kind of comment. When the elevator opened onto the boardroom floor, 3 board members waiting in the corridor turned to see who was coming. One of them looked at Aiden, then at Samuel, then at Charlotte, trying to read the hierarchy. He couldn't. Inside, Xavier made one more attempt to establish control. He gestured toward Aiden and said to the assembled board, with a thin smile, "This is the individual who caused the disruption downstairs. He arrived unannounced with his daughter and a sealed envelope, and he has now managed to delay a transaction worth $400 million. One board member laughed. Another asked, not unkindly but not kindly, whether Aiden owned even a single share of the company. Aiden set Grace in a chair near the door with her rabbit, walked to the far end of the conference table, and waited. Samuel placed the document case on the surface, looked around the room, and said, "Before any instrument is signed today, This room needs to verify my client's legal identity. He opened the case and removed the first binder. He began to read. Aiden Cole, trustee and controlling beneficiary of Cole Family Trust. The words did not cause immediate chaos. They landed the way a stone lands in deep water. The disturbance was quiet at first, spreading outward in rings. Samuel continued without pausing, as though the silence were scheduled. The Cole Family Trust held a class of preferred equity that carried supermajority approval rights over any single transaction asset sale exceeding 30% of total company book value. The Pediatric Care and Hospital Rehabilitation Division, as last assessed, represented approximately 34%. Furthermore, the trust held a secured creditor position in the company's convertible debt that granted first priority over any proceeds from a distressed or expedited sale. Without Aiden Cole's documented consent, the transaction before the board this morning was not just strategically questionable, it was structurally invalid. The oldest member of the board, a man named Gerald who had been with Sterling Harbor since its founding and rarely spoke in these meetings, leaned forward. How was this position accumulated without board awareness? Samuel explained, calmly and without drama, that the trust's ownership had been structured through a blind instrument that complied fully with all relevant disclosure regulations while preserving the family's right to privacy, particularly following the death of the trust's co-beneficiary. Margaret Cole, notifications, as required, had been dispatched to the relevant corporate offices. Charlotte looked at Xavier. Xavier looked at the table. Lisa spoke up from near the doorway, her voice careful but steady. Miss Sterling, I found 2 of the registered notices in the CFO's document queue. They were flagged as processed, but they were never forwarded to your calendar or to legal. The room absorbed this, Aiden said, from the end of the table, without raising his voice. That wasn't a system error. Xavier turned to him with the managed composure of a man who had survived boardroom pressure before. You're making an accusation with a great deal of inference, and very little. I'm making an observation, Aiden said. The inference is available to everyone in this room. His eyes stayed on Xavier for a moment, level and without heat. Then he looked away, not at Charlotte, not at the board, at Grace, who was sitting in her chair with the rabbit on her lap, watching the room with the particular attention that children give when they understand something has shifted but are not yet sure what. The full weight of the last 90 minutes arrived in Charlotte's chest all at once, not as fury and not as shame, but as something quieter and harder to name. She had watched this man walk into her lobby with nothing she recognized as currency, no title, no visible claim, and she had decided in about 4 seconds that he was a problem to be removed. She had made that decision in front of his daughter. She had made it publicly. She had made it wrong. Sergeant Brewer, who had come upstairs as a formality, leaned toward Charlotte and asked, in a low voice, whether she still wanted to pursue any form of formal complaint. The room waited. Charlotte looked at Aiden. Aiden answered before she could. No complaint necessary, he said. Officers responded to information they were given. That's their job. Logan gave a brief nod, the kind that acknowledged something beyond the words. Samuel set his hands flat on the table and looked at Charlotte. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of a man who did not need volume to be heard. Miss Sterling, he said, you have just called the police to detain the only person in this building who can keep your company solvent. Aiden opened the envelope. He did it without ceremony, peeling the wax seal cleanly and drawing out a set of folders with the economy of someone who had done this kind of work before. He placed the first one on the table and opened it to the relevant page without shuffling. He began. The acquiring entity in the proposed transaction, he said, had been incorporated in Delaware 11 months prior. Its declared principal was a registered investment vehicle with a name that sounded institutional and a structure that was almost entirely opaque. Trace the ownership 1 layer down, and you found a management company. 1 layer below that, a family office registered in Nevada. The beneficial owners of that family office included 2 individuals whose last names appeared in Xavier Blackwood's personal financial disclosures as immediate relatives. He placed the document on the table and let the board members read. The proposed sale price, he continued, was 38% below the most recent independent appraisal of the division, an appraisal completed just 7 months prior by a firm the company itself had commissioned. He placed that appraisal on the table. 3 of the 4 advisory fees associated with structuring the transaction had been routed through intermediary consulting entities that did not appear to have active websites, registered employees, or physical addresses. He placed those records on the table as well, and the pediatric endowment, the protected fund that Margaret Cole had once noted in a margin, in her careful handwriting would, under the terms of the proposed agreement, be reclassified as a general liability upon transfer of the division. That reclassification would allow the acquiring entity to dissolve it within 60 days of closing, without triggering any public disclosure requirement. Charlotte was very still. Xavier said, "These are circumstantial. Association does not constitute fraud." "You're right," Aiden said. "That determination belongs to a regulator. I'm not here to convict anyone. I'm here to make sure this room doesn't sign something today that it can't walk back." He set down the last folder and was quiet for a moment. Then Xavier made the mistake of going further. He turned to the board with an expression of practiced concern and said that Aiden Cole was, at his core, a grieving man who had spent the better part of 3 years constructing a narrative of conspiracy from routine corporate activity. That grief was understandable. That it was being presented in a boardroom as evidence was not. The word grief landed exactly where Xavier had aimed it. Grace's head came up. Aiden did not raise his voice. He did not move. He said, "Don't use my wife to cover your signature." Silence. Samuel reached into the case and placed one final document on the table. It was a page and a half, handwritten. The handwriting was fine and deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who chose their words carefully. A memorandum authored by Margaret Cole completed, as best as could be determined, approximately 6 weeks before her death, in which she had flagged an anomaly in the company's advisory fee structure and noted that it warranted further review. She had not known exactly what she was looking at, but she had known it was worth noting. Charlotte looked at the page for a long time. Then she reached across the table and turned the unsigned contract so that it faced her. She read the signature line at the bottom. She closed the folder. "The signing is suspended," she said. "Effective right now." What followed was the kind of organized chaos that Charlotte Sterling was, under most circumstances, quite good at managing. Board members spoke over one another. Gerald asked for an emergency audit referral. 2 people tried to reach outside counsel simultaneously. Logan Brewer moved quietly to the door and asked Xavier Blackwood, with the particular courtesy reserved for people who might later need to be compelled, to remain in the building while the relevant parties clarified the morning's events. Xavier objected. Logan was patient about it. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, and for the first time in 14 months at Sterling Harbor, she did not know what the next 30 seconds would require of her. She had spent her entire tenure preparing for threats from outside, from investors, from competitors, from the slow institutional skepticism of people who did not want to follow her lead. She had not prepared for the possibility that the most significant threat had been in the room next to her the whole time, thanking her publicly and undermining her privately. She turned and looked at the room, at Lisa, holding the printed notification chain with both hands, at board members, some reading Aiden's documents, and some watching Charlotte with tentative expressions that were recalibrating their loyalty in real time, at Logan, patient by the door, and at Grace. Grace was still sitting in her chair. The rabbit was in her lap. She was looking at Charlotte the way a child looks at something she is trying to understand, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the particular gravity of someone who has decided to take a situation seriously. Charlotte walked around the table. She was aware of how the room watched her move. She stopped at the chair where Grace was sitting and lowered herself to one knee. It was, in terms of geometry, approximately the same height Aiden had been forced to kneel in the lobby. Both of them had ended up at that level in front of something that could not be argued with. The difference was that one of them had been pushed there by power, and one had arrived there by conscience. "I made a mistake this morning," Charlotte said to Grace. "I was scared about something, and I let it make me unfair to your dad. I'm sorry." Grace looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at her father. Aiden stood near the window. He gave the smallest possible nod. Not instruction, just permission. The space to decide for herself. Grace looked back at Charlotte. She did not speak, but she did not look away either. Charlotte rose. She did not try to explain herself further. She turned to the board. "I want a complete file on every communication, flagged, routed, or held in the last 60 days that came from Clark and Associates or referenced the Cole Family Trust. I want to know the path it took and whose hand it passed through." Her voice was steady, almost quiet. "Nothing gets signed until I know who was speaking for this company and who was speaking for themselves." What Aiden asked for was modest enough to be disarming. He did not leverage his position into a seat on the board. He did not threaten to call in the debt or trigger the preferred equity clauses in a way that would have forced an emergency capitalization. He had the legal standing to do both. He exercised neither. Instead, through Samuel, he presented 3 requests. The first was formal and immediate. The proposed divestiture was to be withdrawn from consideration pending review. The second was structural. An independent auditor, agreed upon by both parties within 72 hours, would examine the advisory fee flows and the corporate relationships flagged in his documentation. The third was operational. Xavier Blackwood was to be suspended from all financial decision-making authority for the duration of the audit. The board agreed to all 3 within 20 minutes. They did not have meaningful grounds to refuse. Xavier was escorted from the boardroom with a degree of composure that the situation probably did not warrant. He said as he left that he expected to be fully vindicated by any competent examination of the record. Logan noted the statement for the follow-up he was already planning to file. Mason Rowe was placed on administrative review. Aiden had not requested that specifically, but the board's head of operations had done the arithmetic himself. A security chief who had served as an instrument of misinformation, whether knowingly or not, had created a liability the company could not leave unaddressed. When Aiden was informed of the decision, he said only that he hoped the outcome included better training on what threat assessment actually required, not punishment. Better practice. Logan caught him near the door as the room began to clear and told him, quietly, that he had every right to file a formal grievance, that there would be no difficulty establishing the call had been made on misleading information. Aiden looked at the chair where Grace had been sitting. She had fallen asleep against the armrest, her rabbit tucked under her chin, her head dropped slightly to one side in the way children sleep when they have exhausted themselves trying to stay alert through things they couldn't quite follow but knew were important. "I'll think about it," he said. "Right now, I need to take her home." Logan nodded. He watched Aiden walk to Grace, crouch beside the chair, and lift her very carefully so as not to wake her. The girl stirred, found her father's shoulder without opening her eyes, and settled back under. No one in the hallway moved to stop them. Charlotte was standing near the elevator when Aiden came through with Grace in his arms. She stepped back to let him pass. He stopped anyway. He looked at her not with anger, not with pity, which would have been its own kind of condescension, the way someone looks when they want to leave behind something that might be useful. "You weren't wrong because you didn't know who I was," he said. "You were wrong because you thought it didn't matter." The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. Charlotte stood in the hallway and watched them close. The audit took 11 days. On the 12th, the report landed on Charlotte's desk at 7 in the morning. She read it before anyone else arrived. The findings were detailed and extensive, and in most of the respects that mattered, they confirmed what Aiden had presented in that boardroom. The advisory fee routing had not been a system anomaly. It had been deliberate. Xavier Blackwood's connection to the acquiring entity was structural and undisclosed. The legal consequences were now a matter for investigators and attorneys who worked in offices Charlotte had never visited. She was advised not to comment publicly while that process was underway, which suited her. She drafted a letter to Aiden. It took 4 attempts and was still, by the time she sent it, imperfect. She acknowledged what had happened clearly, without hedging the central facts. She said she had failed to exercise judgment in a moment that required it, and that she was sorry for what Grace had been made to witness. She did not ask for anything in return. He did not reply for 4 days. She had almost stopped expecting a response when Lisa, who had been more attuned to the aftermath than Charlotte had realized, mentioned that Aiden took Grace to a community arts center on Saturday mornings to a watercolor class that ran from 9 until 11. The center was 12 minutes from Charlotte's office. She went on the 3rd Saturday after the audit concluded. She came alone. No assistant, no car. She walked. She had considered and discarded 3 outfits, which was not a thing she normally did, and ultimately settled on something that did not look like a boardroom and did not look like she was trying to look like she had not thought about it. The class was still running when she arrived. Through the window, she could see a row of small children at low tables, each with a sheet of watercolor paper and a cup of cloudy water. Grace was near the center of the row, her tongue slightly out in concentration, painting something that might have been a rabbit or might have been a cloud. The worn white rabbit was sitting upright on the edge of the table, watching. Aiden was in the hallway with a paper cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had made peace with waiting. When he saw Charlotte, he did not look surprised. He did not look pleased. He looked like he was deciding something. She did not lead with an apology. She had already sent that. "I'm not here about the company," she said. "I know," he said. She leaned against the wall a few feet from him, and they both looked through the window at the class. Neither spoke for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that exists between people who have already said the hard things and are not sure yet what comes after. "I grew up being told that if you showed softness," Charlotte said eventually, "someone would find it and use it against you." Aiden was quiet for a moment. "After my wife died, I thought if I controlled enough variables, I could keep Grace from being hurt by anything. It took about a year to understand that controlling things and protecting things are not the same." Through the window, Grace looked up from her painting, noticed her father, and smiled the complete, uncomplicated smile of a child who has not yet learned to make it smaller. Charlotte watched it happen. She did not say anything, but she stayed. At the end of the class, Aiden asked, without any particular weight in his voice, whether she would be interested in advising on Sterling Harbor's restructuring process in a formal capacity. She said only if every decision started with the truth. He said that was the only way he knew how to work. She said that was a good start. 3 months after that Saturday, Sterling Harbor announced a new restructuring plan. It had been developed with input from an independent advisory group whose principal consultant was listed only as an external fiduciary representative. People who needed to know who he was already did. The pediatric division was not sold. It was reorganized as a protected nonprofit subsidiary, funded through a dedicated endowment, now explicitly shielded from any future divestiture agreement. The children's ward remained open. The staff, who had been waiting out the uncertainty on month-to-month contract renewals, received permanent employment offers in the same week. The memo Charlotte sent to the full company on a Wednesday morning was read and reread in break rooms on every floor. She had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify, but easy to observe. She still ran the company with precision, but she had stopped mistaking speed for strength and silence for agreement. When a junior analyst in a risk meeting offered a dissenting view that none of the senior staff had bothered to voice, Charlotte asked him to walk through it. The meeting ran long. No one complained. On a Friday evening in early spring, Aiden and Grace arrived at the reopening ceremony for the Pediatric Care Center's new family wing. Grace was wearing a pale yellow dress, and the white rabbit, brushed and somewhat rehabilitated, was in the crook of her arm. The building smelled of fresh paint and donated flowers, and the hallways held the modest, sincere celebration of something that had been almost lost and had been returned. Charlotte found them near the entrance. By a wall of photographs installed for the occasion, images of families the program had served over the years. She crouched in front of Grace and asked, without urgency, whether she was doing all right. Grace looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not scared of you anymore." Charlotte held very still. "Good," she said. "I'm glad." She stood and looked at Aiden. He was watching his daughter, but he turned, and for a moment their eyes met with the particular directness of two people who have run out of the kind of conversation that protects you from the real one. "Thank you," Charlotte said, "for not using what you had to take me apart." "I know what it feels like," Aiden said, "to be judged in your worst moment." Behind them, Grace had moved toward the photographs on the wall, pointing at one she found interesting. Then she turned, found Charlotte's hand, and pulled her gently toward Aiden, the way children do when they have decided that the grown-ups around them have waited long enough. She looked up at both of them and said, "Daddy says people can be wrong about us, but they can learn." The hallway did not go silent the way a courtroom does, with gravity and verdict. It went quiet the way a room does when something true has been said out loud by someone too young to know it needed to be said carefully. The afternoon light came through the high windows and fell across the three of them, and the difficult morning at Sterling Harbor settled into the past, where hard things eventually go not forgotten, not erased, but changed into something that could be carried without the same weight. Charlotte smiled at Grace, then at Aiden. She asked if they had plans after the ceremony. He said they did not. She said she knew a place nearby that made very good pancakes. For the first time, Charlotte Sterling understood that the person who makes a room go silent is not the one with the power to call the police. It is the one with enough character to forgive, after being forced to the floor and the grace to mean it.